Let's open in prayer together. Lord, I thank you that we have this morning together. I thank you that we have the freedom to be baptized without hindrance, that we don't have to hide and avoid rivers in fear of police officers or anything like that. Lord, I thank you that we can come and look at your word, that we can come and reflect on the things you have done through your church through the ages. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, so if you haven't been here recently, we just finished a series on Genesis and have started a very short series on the early history of the church. Last week we did an overview. We said we're going to be looking at the age between 70 AD and 313 AD. We picked this age. It's sort of an age of persecution. From the Jewish persecution, starting with within the Bible itself, and then the Neronian persecution in 54 to 68, all the way up till the Romans sort of take over the persecuting lead. And Rome stops at around 312, 313, because the Roman emperor at the time, Constantine, becomes a Christian and legalizes Christianity at the Edict of Milan. So within this period is persecution. Before we start, I want to talk about a couple things. One I meant to talk about last week is biases. Biases makes the study of history rather difficult, and this period in particular is made difficult by Catholic-Protestant debates and by liberal-conservative debates. The Catholics need to prove, if they want to be Catholics, that there was a pope in this period. Because if there wasn't a pope for the first 300 years, there shouldn't be a pope now. And the Protestants, to prove that they don't have to listen to the pope, have to prove that there isn't a pope. And frankly, nobody in this time period was talking about that issue. So it makes it, when you read historians, that's the issue they're interested in. It's not the issue that the people living at the time were interested in. I'll give you an example. Around the year 190-ish, the Catholics call him Pope Victor. The Protestants call him Victor. He excommunicated everyone in Asia Minor. That's a Roman province, right around here. And all the other churches said, you can't do that. You can't just excommunicate an entire province because they disagree with you about when to celebrate Easter. And the bishop stepped down and said, you're right, I guess I can't. And so he didn't. And the Catholics want to say, look, the Bishop of Rome must have been Pope. How else could he excommunicate an entire province? And the Protestants want to say, look, he couldn't do it because the church wouldn't let him. Proves he's not the Pope. That's not what they were concerned about. They were concerned about Easter. The liberals and conservatives debate over these years because the liberals want to say, this is what I was taught when I went to university, the church was very broad, much broader than it is today. They believed all kinds of things. The way they do this, actually, is they broaden the definition of church to include heretics that the church at the time would not have included in their definition of church. They would have emphatically not included them. They would have said those guys are not Christians. They're using Jesus and putting him alongside other gods or manipulating him into someone he's not, making him out to be a wizard or some kind of spirit man who wasn't God, or even just a man who was confused and thought of as God by Paul, but all the other apostles thought he wasn't God. That kind of silliness. And the church was quite unified in saying, no, those guys aren't Christians, they're heretics. Liberals want to say, oh, look how diverse they were. They believed all kinds of things. They need to say that because if they don't, then they're not Christians. There are churches out there, they deny that Jesus is God, they deny that Jesus rose from the dead, and in order for them to stay Christians, they have to broaden the definition of church, and they do that with this period. Walter Bauer has a lot of interesting work in that direction, if you're ever interested. Protestants want to show that the Bible has always been the authority. Conservatives want to show this. So that debate plays out in this period. If you get into those debates, all the figures from these years figure prominently. What I want to do in these few lessons we have is focus on the things that they talked about to give you a sense of what life was like then. Carl Trueman's a historian I like. He says the aim of the historian is to make history strange. I like that. You have to make it strange to understand they lived in a different world, a world you can't even imagine. You won't understand Luther, for example, unless you understand, in his day, people thought there were goblins outside at night. Luther himself tells a story where he says, oh yeah, back in my town there's a hill and there's a pond in it, and if you throw a brick in the pond, the storms come because the pond is filled with trapped demons. And everybody thought like that. It's a different world that the Reformation broke into. Like, they wouldn't have even thought to ask, is the Bible true? They assumed the Bible was true, and it was shocking that the church wasn't. So I want to make that world a little strange to you, but I also want to make it similar. I want to show you there's a lot of things that haven't changed. Human nature hasn't changed. The gospel hasn't changed. Our faith is one and the same faith that the apostles had. It's the same faith that the church had in the early years. That said, though I want to emphasize the things they emphasized, I can't. Because some of the things they emphasized are just absolutely irrelevant, and I don't have that much time. I could spend an hour explaining to you. Irenaeus, for example, in the year 180, wrote a book called Adversus Haereses, Against Heresies. And he argues that this one group of heretics is wrong by explaining what they believe in hundreds and hundreds of pages. And what they believe is so bizarre, I think it might even trump Mormonism. It's just bizarre. They believed in 30 aeons that aren't quite gods. I won't get into it. If I go there, this is going to be a useless exercise for everyone involved. So, my aim is to look at the things they said that are relevant for us today. That's what I'm trying to do in our few weeks on this subject. Today we're going to talk about persecution. We're going to talk about its causes. I'm not going to go over every instance of persecution. Like I said last week, there are major events that shape how and when it happens. I said that after 70 AD, after the destruction of Jerusalem, the Christians were seen by the Jewish people as traitors, and they didn't really persecute the Christians as much after that. They were seen as a different religion, but they actually still did until about 132, 133, because around that time, a Jewish false messiah by the name of Bar Kokhba, which means son of a star, led a revolt. He claimed to be the Messiah, and he killed any Christians who wouldn't join him. And he led a war against Rome, and Rome beat them up and destroyed Jerusalem again, set up a new city in Jerusalem called Aelia Capitolina, named after himself, of course, the general Hadrian who conquered the place, devoted the city to Jupiter. And after that, the Jews were pretty much incapable of persecuting the Christians. It's not that they didn't want to, it's that there was a time when they were able to incite the Roman authorities against Christians, and that time was over. They didn't get along with Rome before, but now they really don't, and so they're not going to be able to use Rome to get at Christians anymore. So we have that, but then you have a major event like in 250. It's the first universal persecution of Christians. Emperor Decius, he orders that all throughout the empire, Christians are going to be killed. And again, that doesn't last very long, actually. In 259, the next emperor, he passes an edict that basically says, yeah, just tolerate them. So from 260 all the way up to 303, there's peace for Christians everywhere, basically. But then in 303, you have another major event where Diocletian passes 3 edicts. And he says, every church everywhere is burned. All the Bibles, burned. All the liturgy, burned. If you have a hymnal, burn it. If you find a pastor, put him in prison. It's actually said that they had to kick criminals out of prison to make room for all the pastors that were imprisoned in this time period, because they didn't have the funding to just build bigger prisons. They had to get rid of criminals. And then in 304, he made it even worse. He said everyone, everywhere, not just Christians, everyone has to offer sacrifices to the gods. And if they don't, they'll be killed. Obviously, that only affects Christians. So you have major things like this, where everyone's affected. But for the most part, you have little skirmishes here and there. And Emperor Trajan ruled from 98 to 117. He ordered that it would work this way. Don't seek out Christians. It's not a crime to be a Christian. But if you find somebody is accused of being a Christian and he admits it, then you can prosecute him with the full extent of the law. And so you had, here and there, somebody would get upset with Christians. Some criminals might go kill Christians, and the government would go, okay, whatever. It was here and there, sporadic. I can't cover every instance because there's too many and I don't know them all. I will probably talk about a few of them here and there. But what I want to talk about mostly for the next bit is the causes of persecution. Why did the Jews persecute the church, and then why did Rome persecute the church? Ultimately, this goes right back to Genesis. God says, I will put enmity between the seed of the woman and the seed of the serpent. It's tempting to think that the serpent puts the enmity there. In some sense, he does. But we have to remember as we look at this, remember Psalm 2. Why do the nations rage and the peoples plot in vain? It is in vain. They plot against the Lord and against his anointed, saying, let us burst his bonds, throw them away from us. As we look at the causes in this period and in our own, it often doesn't appear that the reason the church is persecuted is because people hate God. They often come up with other reasons. Maybe they love God. Remember, in I believe it's John 16, Jesus said, there's coming a day when those who kill you will think they're doing service to God. Sometimes it's because they love their nationalism. In India right now, it's one of the most dangerous places to be a Christian. Not because they say, we hate Jesus. The government doesn't have a stance like that. That would be too obvious. It's Christianity is associated with foreign influence, and it goes against their nationalistic spirit. People come up with other reasons. So I want to look at the reasons given, because there are lots of different reasons persecution can come up. One of the reasons I want to do this is I think we have this idea in our heads that unless the government says, I hate Christians and I hate Jesus, and persecutes you for that reason, then we're not allowed to call it persecution or something silly like that. That's just not true. If Satan had to be that obvious, he would be a terrible liar, and he's been a liar from the beginning. He's good at it. Okay, start with a Jewish persecution. I'm going to turn this over to you in a sec. Jews don't normally persecute people, do they? Can you think of any time in the Old Testament where the Jews are known for persecuting people? Any time in history that comes to mind? The last century? They're sort of a persecuted group, aren't they? Not famous for leading persecutions. Why did they persecute Christianity? There were lots of pagans in the ancient world. There were lots of idolaters. Why did they persecute Christianity? This one you'd know it entirely from the Bible. That's why I'm handing it over to you.
They claimed the heritage of Judaism and ended the prevailing process, basically. Saying Jesus is the final sacrifice.
Okay. But why couldn't they just say, okay, you have your religion, we have ours? Why do they have to persecute them?
Because they were spreading it, taking in the Jews.
Yeah, it's one reason. There's a more obvious reason.
Well, Jesus said to his brothers in chapter 7 of John, the world cannot hate you, but it hates me because I testify that its deeds are evil.
Yeah?
They claimed that Jesus was Messiah.
Mm-hmm. But there were lots of false Jewish messiahs that they didn't persecute. Remember Gamaliel's advice? He says, if this is of God, we won't be able to stop it. But if it's not, it'll just patter out like every other false messiah that we didn't have to stop because the Romans just come and kill them. To me, it seems the most clear reason would be from Deuteronomy, actually. Deuteronomy, God explains that he hates idolatry. He does not want his people to worship idols. And he gives a penalty for idolatry. If Israel finds someone in their land, an Israelite, worshiping a false god, they're to take him outside the city and stone him. That was the Torah. That was God's law. He said, if people worship false gods in your land, you stone them. Not just anyone, but Jews specifically. The Jews are not allowed to worship false gods. The Christians are worshiping God. At the beginning of the church, almost all the Christians are Jewish. Even though, Acts chapter 10, we get Cornelius joins. Is it Cornelius? Did I make that up? The Roman centurion. Okay. The Gentiles come in, but the church is still predominantly Jewish. It's predominantly led by Jews. The churches, even when Paul went around, were all started in synagogues. The rabbis are probably, almost certainly, going to be the ones, when they're converted, who are made into pastors. They're the ones who know the Bible well. It would be kind of silly to have some Gentile convert, reading through Genesis, preaching on it when there's a rabbi in the room. The church is Jewish, and Jews are all turning away from the perspective of Judaism. They're turning away from God and his law to follow this false god, a mere man. Paul says in Acts 25 that he has worshipped God with a pure conscience to this very day. This is the same Paul who went around persecuting Christians. He says, I have lived my entire life with a pure conscience. Because he was sincere. As a Jew, he sincerely believed, like Jesus said, they will think that they are serving God by killing you. And that's what Paul thought. He believed that that is honestly what the Bible told him to do. But it wasn't, because he hadn't understood who Jesus was. So the Jews, in an effort to... Paul says, I appeal concerning them, or I testify about them. They have a real zeal, but not according to knowledge, in Romans 9, remember. They are zealous for the law, but not for God. God told them in Deuteronomy that if they do not obey his law, as in if they don't kill the false idol worshippers, then he will come and kick them out of their land. So they are doing it out of a false fear of God. This is very similar, actually, to the reason that Rome persecuted the church. The common cry of the Roman people concerning Christians was, death to the atheists. You ever heard that? The Christians were considered atheists because everyone in the world believed in this God and that God and the other God and 100 gods and a million gods, and every God has 1,000 names or whatever because it's called this over here, called that over here. And the Christians refused to worship any of them. All of the holidays in the calendar revolved around temples and gods. Birthdays would be at temples, and the Christians refused to participate. They're extremely antisocial. Wouldn't come to any of the parties, wouldn't come to this. They just wouldn't do anything. They wouldn't participate in politics, wouldn't go to war. They were atheists. They were against the gods. Now, we live in a world, at least in our Western world, where we are religiously tolerant, or at least we say we are. We're not going to have the government force one religion or another. That makes a lot of sense within a sort of deistic worldview, which a lot of the founding fathers of America had. That makes no sense in a Roman worldview. Try to put yourself in the shoes of the Romans for a second. You actually believe in Zeus, the god of the lightning and thunder, brings rain. There was no rain this year. There was a famine. Why might that be? Why might Zeus not have brought rain? Hey, what's this group of Christians here? They've all stopped worshiping Zeus. Well, maybe that made Zeus a little upset. Maybe that's why he didn't bring rain. Throughout this period, wherever there was more famine, wherever there was more drought, wherever there was more war, Remember, everything in the world is associated with some god or another. So whenever there was a problem, it's because the gods are angry. And whenever there was a problem, like famine, like drought, whenever the river would dry up, they'd say, throw the Christians to the lions. It must be their fault. They're not only not worshiping the gods, they're convincing other people not to worship the gods. And if everybody believes the gods are real, and they really did believe the gods were real, then the way to save your crops, the way to save your family, the way to protect your country is to kill those guys. They are dangerous. They are ruining our nation. They are ruining the entire empire with their false atheism nonsense. Now, because they already hate the Christians, they're able to believe all kinds of lies and rumors about them. It was common to say that Christians were cannibals. They get together and they say they eat their Lord's flesh and blood. They're cannibals. And the rumors spread, and people believed it because they already hate them. People are like that still. You meet either side of the political spectrum has only heard lies about the other side. Very easy to believe lies when you already hate someone. They're involved in incest. There's this Christian, he calls everybody brother. He calls his own wife his sister. What's with that? These are some messed up people to say they're all family. And then they have these love feasts all the time. This is a practice that has died out, but the early church had these love feasts. They're called the agape feast. Well, what's that about? We already hate them. Let's just assume the worst. And on top of all that, the Christians had this moral superiority. They just look down on everybody. They live a life that's so, by their own life, they are judging society. They're against abortion. Abortion is extremely common in the ancient world. It wasn't about woman's choice back then. It was the man's choice. The man tells you to kill the kid, and there's nothing you can do about it. Too bad. You were born a woman in Roman society. They didn't have pills for that. Well, they did, but more commonly, they just take the kid and throw it out in the wilderness. Many of the church's funds, because they'd pool together their money, were devoted to looking after these kids that had been abandoned. They were devoted to burying dead people that hadn't been given a proper burial. They were devoted to caring for people that the rest of the world didn't think was worth caring about. And by just those actions, it pronounced a judgment on the Roman people that they didn't appreciate. The Christians are so good, it makes us look bad. And then they won't join the war. A lot of them were against military service. A lot of them are against political positions. Rather like the Mennonites, I think. The Romans basically came to hate the Christians. Not all of them, not universally. And that's why I say this is sporadic. You have one emperor who says, I hate Christians. Why? Because my predecessor didn't. And I hate the guy who was in charge before me, so I'm going to persecute Christians. You've got someone like Alexander Severus, who, for whatever reason, he set up a statue of Jesus, at least a bust of his head, and put it in his chapel with his other gods. He had this was in the year 222, he had the golden rule engraved in his palace. Then you get another guy who comes along, he's like, okay, back to persecuting. Philip the Arabian, people actually suspected he was a Christian, but he didn't reign very long. It's just back and forth. There's moments when people are persecuted, there's moments when people are not. I say this because I don't want you to think, as you're looking at the modern world, that, unless the whole world is clearly taken from a medieval painting of hell, then we're not being persecuted. Persecution has never been the worst it possibly could be. One day it will be. Jesus says that unless those days were cut short, what does he say? No Christians would survive? Anyone finish the quote?
The elect? None of the elect?
No flesh. Some translations say no human being will survive. But for the sake of the elect, he has cut those days short. He says the tribulation of those days will be worse than anything that ever has come on the world or ever will come on the world. God knew when those words were written down that the Holocaust would happen. He knew what Stalin would do. He even knew that Mao Zedong would have massacred as many as possibly 90 million of his own people in China. God knew all these things, but what I'm trying to say is many antichrists have come. The Antichrist is coming. Don't assume that because it's not as bad as it could be, that you don't live in an age of persecution. What am I doing for time? I don't want to get into modern stuff too much yet, but I will go there later. So it's sporadic. Any questions at this point before we move on? About the causes. I could go on forever about causes and specific examples, and I want to avoid that.
Has there been any studies done on the possible Christian influence when Mount Vesuvius blew in Herculaneum and Pompeii?
There probably has been studies. I wouldn't know. It's the problem with history is, there's 300 years of stuff happened, and I don't have that much time to look into it all. Certainly, any event like that, the Romans would have said, it could be the Christians' fault. Let's kill them about it. So right after 250, you've got the first major persecution of the entire empire. It doesn't last long, but then just a couple years later, it flares up again because there's a lot of drought. Any other questions?
It seems that the blame game has been going on since the Garden.
Yep. I want to talk a bit today about the Christian perspective of suffering and persecution that comes out of this period. There's a lot of examples. I'm going to focus on one work called The Martyrdom of Polycarp. You've all heard of Polycarp? Polycarp was the disciple of John the Apostle. He served the Lord for 86 years. He was seen as the teacher of Asia. By the Romans, he was seen as the misleader of the people. And when he died, the church wrote down the account in a letter, and it was an encyclical letter. It was a letter meant to be sent to all the churches. Because the church had this understanding that that martyrdom is a display of great faith, and that a testimony to that will be an encouragement to the rest of the church. When God so works in a person that he's able to die joyfully, that he's able to endure the suffering for the joy set before him, following the footsteps of Christ, when he's able to die and pray for those who persecute him in the moment of his death, the church saw that as an instance where God's power is seen, and if God can do it for him, he can do it for you. And so they wrote it down to share with the whole church. But before they got, if you're reading in the letter, before they began to tell the story of Polycarp, they first tell the story of a man named Quintus from Phrygia. And I want to share it with you too because I think it's pertinent. Quintus was overly zealous for death. He wanted to die a martyr. Because everyone knew if you die a martyr, that's like the sure way to heaven. That's like the sure way to get God to love you. If God's going to love anybody, it's going to be the guy who lays down his life for a friend. Greater love has no man than that. So he wants to be that guy. This was very common. At the end of the 3rd century, at the end of the 2nd century, Tertullian said that where he was in Ephesus, or at least where he'd been, he didn't live in Ephesus, he lived in Africa. But when he'd been to Ephesus, there were many Christians who begged the governor to kill them. When Diocletian began his persecution and set up the edict and sent it to Nicomedia, there was a Christian by the name of Eudius who tore it down, and he was the first one to be martyred. It's fairly common. I hope you notice this isn't direct going absolutely against Jesus' advice on this subject. He said, if they reject you in one town, flee to the next. You won't get through all the towns in Israel before the Son of Man comes. But people were excited. They wanted to die for Jesus. Remember the apostles in Acts 5:41, I believe it is. They rejoice that they are counted worthy to suffer for Christ. And there's people who are so excited about this that they want to go and die. So in the letter about Polycarp, they start with the story of Quintus. Quintus wanted to die. Not because he hated life, but because he wanted to show his absolute zeal for God. And he offered himself over, but when he saw the wild beasts that were going to eat him, he had some second thoughts and changed his mind about the whole thing and denounced Christ. And they share this story to remind the churches, look, Jesus never said to try and die, and your fanaticism is not proof that you have true faith. You go, I haven't been on Facebook in a while, but I'll bet this is still true. You go on Facebook and you see people post outlandish things. You know, they're against abortion, they're against gay, LGBT stuff, they're right about a lot of issues, and they're mad about it. And they want the world to know that they are on Jesus' side. And you just go, okay, if persecution comes, these guys are going to be the first to go. You just know it. They're because of their fanaticism. And so the church includes this in the letter to say, look, just because you're fanatical right now does not mean that you have the kind of faith that endures. Fanaticism is not a proof of enduring faith. It's just a proof that you got too much energy or something like that. So they share this first. They want you to be encouraged to endure to the end. Jesus says those who endure to the end will be saved. They want you to be encouraged to walk in the footsteps of faith of the martyrs who have gone before. But they don't want you to go and die just for the sake of it. We're put in the church to serve, not to die. And if we're counted worthy, that's a blessing from God, they said. But don't go trying to get it. It's given by God, not by you. So then they go into the story of Polycarp. I'll just tell you a bit of it, because all it is a picture of someone who's lived a godly life for us to admire and follow. Paul says, imitate me as I imitate Christ. That applies to everyone. I want to imitate Pastor Dan as he imitates Christ. I want to imitate Wayne as he imitates Christ. Imitate people as they imitate Christ. Polycarp, when he found out that he was going to be killed, he didn't flee to the next town. He did. He flew a little bit out of town, so they'd have to come looking for him, but he wasn't impossible to find. They were looking for him. You could flee to the next town if they just hate you in the town. You can't flee to the next town if you're the teacher of Asia. They'll find you. And he spent all of his days until the soldiers came to get him, praying for everyone he'd ever met and everyone he ever knew in the church throughout the whole world. Spent his whole days fasting and in prayer. I don't know how old he was. Some say he was very old, but he'd been serving God for 86 years. Just an old man, off on his own, praying. People would come visit him and pray with him. Then the Romans came, and he wanted to take him away. He says, I just got to finish praying first. He prays for the Romans, the soldiers. He prays for everybody. By the time that he's done praying, the soldiers are like, we really got to arrest this guy? Just an old man praying. Like, what could he have possibly done wrong? But they bring him to the proconsul, and they're going to feed him to the lions. And the proconsul says, you're old. Do you really want to be fed to the lions? Think about your age, man. Just how hard is it to say Kaiser Kurios? That's Greek for Caesar is Lord. Almost the same phrase, actually, that occurs in Philippians. One day, every tongue will confess or every knee will bow and every tongue confess that Kyrios Jesus Christus, not Kaiser Kyrios, Jesus Christus Kyrios, Jesus Christ is Lord. And he says, how, when I have served God, I've served Jesus 86 years, and he has never injured me, how could I go against him now? And he says, just say, death to the atheists. And he looks out into the crowd. He waves his hand and goes, death to the atheists. Yeah. He knows who denies the real God. They try to feed him to the lions. The lions won't eat him. They try to burn him alive. As the story goes, the fire wouldn't eat him either, so they end up stabbing him to death. And the story spread quite quickly. He was someone who endured to the end. There's more stories like that than I can count. I'm sure somebody's tried, but the fact is people writing at that time said they couldn't count them all. But they loved the martyrs. They loved to imitate them. They celebrated the day of their death as birthdays in heaven. They would often be, throughout the year, going to their tombs and celebrating together their endurance of faith as a reminder to one another to endure. I want to turn to Hebrews quickly. Hebrews 11. Just to show you, this attitude of the church is extremely biblical. I don't know if it's common today, but it's extremely biblical. This is what he means in Hebrews 12:1, when he says, we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses. There's some people who want to say this verse is talking about, where there's saints in heaven who pray for you or something silly like that. He's just spent a whole chapter talking about people who endured in faith, all the way from Abel to Abraham and then he just kind of wanders off and says, I can't even mention them all, there's so many. They endured in faith. If you don't, they testify against you. They show you God is willing to help you. He's willing to be with you. You can endure in faith. These people testify to that. And we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses. He says, let us also lay aside every weight and sin which clings so closely. Let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking to Jesus, the founder and perfecter of our faith, who, for the joy that was set before him, endured the cross, despising the shame, and is seated at the right hand of God. We're told to consider Christ, and we're told to consider the lives of all these witnesses who have gone before. Abraham, Abel, and this list kept growing, is how the church saw it. There were more people who were faithful, and they testify. All right. Last point. I don't want you, as we talk about persecution, to go away and think, wow, I'm so glad persecution's over. It's kind of cliche at this point. Pastors and teachers often say, persecution could come any day, just be ready. I'm not here to do that. Persecution is sporadic, but it's also local. In 177 in Lyon, here in Gallia, now modern France, there's severe persecution where the servants of Christians, Christians had slaves. Slavery was different back then. I'm not going to get into it. The slaves were forced by the rack to admit that their masters had done all kinds of horrible things like cannibalism and incest and whatever. And then they were killed for it because the slaves were tortured into saying it had happened. But that wasn't happening over here. It wasn't happening over there. It was just happening there. As we look at an age of persecution, it's not usually global. And even what we call global, you'll notice my 5-second drawing of Europe is a drawing of Europe, not actually the world, because it's never been global. Probably will be when the Antichrist comes, but until then, persecutions are sporadic and local. This was the case from the beginning. This was the case in the book of Hebrews. Hebrews is written to Jews in dispersion and in Judea. Look at what he says, if you have your Bibles open still to Hebrews or at all, in chapter 13, verse 3. He says, "Remember those who are in prison as though in prison with them, and those who are mistreated, since you also are in the body." He isn't just saying, beware if they come kill you in your town or if they put you in prison in your town. He's telling them to remember those who are in prison as though present with them. Now, we live in a country that's extremely ideologically isolated, I want to say, where somehow people can be radically ignorant of things going on all over the world. In the last century, there were more martyrdoms than all other 19 centuries combined. There were more than double all the other centuries combined. You have so many dictators. You have just more and more hatred for the gospel. In 2020, Open Doors did a study. They do this study every year where they show how severe persecution is worldwide. And in 2020, they said that there were 260 million Christians undergoing severe persecution worldwide, which was a huge increase from the year prior, which had been 245 million. 15 million increase in 1 year. Over the last 2 years, through COVID and all this, that number has increased to 360 million. In 2020, they averaged that 8 Christians worldwide were killed for their faith every day. In 2022, that average has increased to 16, double Christians killed every day. We have more access than ever. You can go online and find a very in-depth report of all the reasons for persecution in all the 50 most persecuted countries all over the world. And you can get reports, stories from different Christians living in those countries. We're told to remember them as though present with them. We live in a time of persecution, is what I want to leave us with. It might not be right here, but notice what he says. Remember those who are in prison as though in prison with them, and those who are mistreated, since you also are in the body. The body of Christ is suffering worldwide. That's our brothers and sisters. That's our family. I fear that we forget them. I know I do. Because it's not here. It's out of sight, out of mind. But that's not the heart that we're called to. Any questions before I close in prayer? Persecution's in some ways the same as back then, some ways different. Back then it was atheism. Now it's quite similar. Many of the top 50 countries in the world for persecution are Muslim countries, where they believe that Allah will be angry if you reject Allah and follow Jesus. And so, in Afghanistan, for example, which is the number 1 persecuted country in the world right now, if a young girl were to follow Christ, her own father might ask her brother to kill her because he's young and he can get away with it legally. And everyone around would go, yeah, that's understandable. Because like the Jews and the Romans then, they're religiously zealous for what they truly believe. They've been deceived. You got communism where they don't say we hate Jesus, they say you're against our regime. You had a question there, Wayne.
Just a word of encouragement. There's a place in the New Testament where it says that endurance and perseverance and endurance come from God. So we don't have to worry when it happens. And that's what Wesley said. Somebody asked him, are you afraid to die? How do you feel about dying? He said, I'm only going to face that. I'm only going to think about that when I'm dying. I know God's grace is sufficient. So
With that in mind, I'm going to actually end on a verse where Jesus says that exact same thing. I always think it's in Luke 25, and then I turn there and that doesn't exist. It's in Luke 20. It's in Luke 20-something, 20. Always throws me off when Luke 25 doesn't exist. Where is it? There it is, 21. Jesus said, "Watch yourselves," talking about persecutions to come, "lest your hearts be weighed down with dissipation and drunkenness, and cares of this life." By the way, in the between 260 and 303, there was this period of repose. The church was able to build buildings for itself, really nice buildings. They were able to spread, and the historian Eusebius writes shortly after that they grew extremely lax and immoral, and that the persecution was almost needed. Jesus warns about this. It's not like he didn't see it coming. "Watch yourselves, lest your hearts be weighed down with dissipation and drunkenness, cares of this life, and that day comes suddenly like a trap. It will come upon all who dwell on the face of the world. But stay awake at all times, praying that you may have strength to escape all these things that are going to take place, and to stand before the Son of Man." Exactly like you say. We ask God for strength because it comes from him. Dear God, I thank you that strength does come from you. Lord, the same strength that is needed to endure in persecution is the strength we need to endure temptation and even the everyday trials. They both come from you, and Lord, I ask that you would grant us that strength today and this week. In Jesus' name, amen. Thank you all for coming. Good to see you here, Jim.